We have heard today a lot about the nexus between agriculture and health and how nutrition fits in the middle of that. And there are some people perhaps in the audience who have worked on all pieces involved in nutrition, health, agriculture. But there's one person here on the advisory committee for the Chicago Council who I'm going to introduce next, who will introduce the final panel. And her career embodies perhaps two of the most important positions in the world that emphasize agriculture, nutrition, and health, because Ann Veneman was the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Executive Director of UNICEF. Ann Veneman.
Good afternoon, it's a great opportunity to be here today and to talk about a very important topic. As you heard this morning, the report that was released by the Chicago Council talks about food and nutrition security. And we've heard the importance of research. We've talked about the need for a broader agenda, including water, including environment and climate change, and that we must focus not just on calories, but on nutrients. Among the recommendations in the report, as you saw this morning, is the need to reinvigorate the trade agenda and to really look at trade as an issue of security and development. For many of us who have worked in the trade arena for a long time, we know that agriculture is one of those areas that is a constant trade irritant, and it often is the make or break part of any trade agreement and the real sticking point of getting agreement in the end. So this panel is going to discuss the importance of trade, the impediments to trade, how we can use trade to advance the development agenda. So I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Yaneer Bar-Yam, who's president of the New England Complex Systems Institute, which works on the research on the impact of price volatility. I think you'll find this very interesting. Dr. Dr. Moephuli from South Africa, who is the CEO of the Agriculture Research Council. We practice his name a lot. Dr. David Nelson, who is the global strategist for Rabobank International, which is the largest financer of food and ag systems, and Mr. Michael Smart, who's the vice president of Rock Creek Global Advisors. He's been working on trade issues for several decades, and we're happy to have all of their expertise. So we're going to get right into the discussion today, starting with Dr. Bar-Yam, and your institute, the New England Complex Systems Institute, has been mapping the correlation of commodity price volatility and social instability. We've talked about this, that when the food price increase, and I was at the UN at the time, in 2008, we saw unrest around the world in various countries, in up to 30 countries. But he's actually put the analysis behind some of these trends that we saw, and I think, why don't you explain what kind of analysis you use and what your findings have been?
Sure, thank you. So first of all, let me say that you don't need me here to tell you that it's a complex world. But one of the main points of complex systems science actually is that sometimes it's possible to understand what is the really important factor in what's going on, or factors. And that's going to be really important if we're going to be able to develop policies, because we have to address those key factors. So the first thing that I want to show you, and indeed something that you've looked at several times today, is the slide up? Okay, I can do this myself. We want to go back now. So this is a slide that in various forms you've seen already today. I don't see how I can point at this. Maybe there's a pointer. Stand up here and do this. So this is the FAO Food Price Index. And these lines are food riots. There were 60 riots in 30 countries or something like that during this period. And these are the ones that had fatalities, and those are indicated here. And over here are the events of the Arab Spring. Now, often we think that there are lots of causes for those events, like bad leaders and such like, poor economic conditions. But this kind of focuses our attention on the causal effects of high food prices in triggering social unrest and political instability. Now, this slide differs from some of the ones you saw earlier in this having this blue line. And that blue line is important because today we're talking about the role of science, and science is partly important because it enables us to anticipate what's going to happen. And indeed, this is the date of a report that we submitted to the government pointing to the problem of high food prices as being related to social unrest and political instability 4 days before Mohamed Bouazizi started things off in Tunisia. So anticipation can happen using scientific tools. One thing that I want to emphasize about this, which probably has been said, but it's really important to realize that when people go out in the streets and riot, they're desperate. So there's a lot of hunger, of course, and a lot of suffering at prices that are well below the point at which people go out into the street. And we shouldn't forget that. But of course, when things break apart in a society, there's a lot of other suffering that goes on. And this is all important to our thinking about food security. Now, this is half of the picture. The other half is the causes of these food price increases. And we have done an analysis that, again, clarified by eliminating many of the causes that people talk about and focusing on the things that are really important in this context. And here, we showed that there are two factors, only two factors that are really important. One is the conversion of corn to ethanol in the United States. That's responsible for this price increase. And the other one is the effect of speculation on commodity markets. And that, if we add them together, we get this red line, which very precisely agrees with a blue line. Now, what this says, and maybe this isn't surprising to many of you here, that a lot of the global problems that we've had with food prices around the world originate here in Washington, D.C., with the policies about ethanol conversion and with the deregulation of commodity markets. Now, I cannot show you all the validation that we've done on this work, but let me show you at least one other thing. We extended the time period of that analysis. And notice that the previous slide ended here. The food price direction changed. So did the model with the analysis, and it still fits. So this is very, very strongly validated. And again, one of the key things is that if you're going to understand what's going on and you really want to solve the problem, you really want to identify the very largest factor that is having an impact on the problem. And if you do that and then address that largest factor, you're going to be able to have the largest impact. There's one other piece that I should mention, and that is that this model includes a model of non-equilibrium behavior, the dynamics of markets. This is not standard in economics, but this is really important if we're going to understand the behavior of our economic systems going forward. And so with that, I will turn it back.
Thanks very much. And I think that raises a very interesting, I need to share everybody hear me, or do I need to use this? I think it raises a very interesting question about some of the actions that countries took as a result of the increasing food prices. And that is, countries sometimes have a tendency to actually put on export controls. They look at how do they ensure their own food security because they're concerned about higher prices. We're looking at a number of trade agreements, so I think I'll turn to you, Michael Smart, and say, put all this in context of trade.
Sure. Well, I mean, I don't have to tell many folks in this audience about the contribution that trade can make to enhancing global food security. I mean, once governments make decisions to reduce trade barriers, to get rid of trade-distorting subsidies, to adopt sanitary and phytosanitary measures that are based on sound science and are transparent, these are the kinds of activities that allow food to flow from areas of where it's plentiful to areas where it's scarce. Now, the trick is that governments rarely take these actions unilaterally, beneficial as they are. They tend to do them in international trade negotiations. After many years of making our best efforts, we failed to get across the finish line in the Doha round. And so now what you see is a proliferation of trade agreements, including by the United States, to basically fill the void and start to continue the process of trade liberalization. And for the United States, that means two agreements in particular. The first is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a negotiation among 11 countries on both sides of the Pacific Rim. An interesting negotiation, and actually for this discussion, maybe the most important element is the impending participation of Japan. Because here is a country that has negotiated a few trade agreements, but generally has minimal coverage of agriculture. This is really the first time when it has jumped into a trade negotiation with the United States and other major agricultural producing countries, understanding that the level of commitment, both on tariffs and SPS measures, are going to be high. And so the decision by Prime Minister Abe to join this negotiation was courageous, and hopefully it will help drive domestic reform. But when you talk about trade responses to price increases, I mean, I think that what an objective should be in trade negotiation is to show countries that they can rely on global markets for their food security. And for the United States, where we have a history of very robust production, this seems intuitive. And when you see countries taking an opposite approach and trying to achieve self-sufficiency, we find that hard to understand. But I think we have to consider, again, through trade agreements, putting in place the type of rules that create greater confidence in the global market. And I think another way for the U.S., folks from the United States to understand this is that, we kind of have a similar psychology of scarcity when it comes to energy. I mean, we're right now in the midst of a very interesting debate about where do we go, what is the intersection between U.S. energy policy and U.S. trade policy? We have this new abundance of unconventional fuels, and for the first time, some people are realizing that you can't just go and export this. You actually have to go to the Department of Energy and receive permission. Why? Because it's thought, well, to the extent we can produce, we need to keep it here. And that really has been, a political tenet. Both presidential candidates agreed on it last year, but we're changing, and we're starting to see ourselves differently and understanding that the market for energy is global. So I just think that's a way to help us understand maybe what motivates certain countries when they encounter a crisis and take steps that they think will alleviate price volatility.
So let's turn to Rabobank. As the largest lender in the agriculture sector worldwide, you must encounter trade barriers, trade impediments, and see what works and what doesn't, and how trade really enhances food security and nutrition security around the world.
Well, we try to. A big part of Rabobank is trade commodity finance, and so we finance not just much of agricultural trade, but all commodities, energy trade as well. And when we have these disruptions, the social disruptions, food security concern disruptions, and then you have a force majeure, right? It causes major challenges. But when you look at bigger picture and longer term, getting countries to abide by the agreements or the obligations they've already made within the WTO, that's a big factor. For instance, with Russia now, in recent months since they've joined, they've broken many of the things they agreed to. But But another factor that's not necessarily policy related that I think is becoming a bigger issue, especially with certain trade dislocations that are taking place, is infrastructure. So we've all known and heard about and seen the pictures of the backups in Brazil. Well, Brazil's going to figure this out. It's going to take a few years, and they've put in some new regulations to make lives better for truckers this year. But Brazil's going to get this. But when you look at just the United States, even within the United States, trade is shifting. We have more grain being imported into the east coast of this country for the chickens and hogs along that part of the country, because less corn is being able to get pulled out of the Midwest because of all the ethanol. So when that happens, you need you need more elevator capacity in one place and less in another. So who would have thought a few years ago that the U.S. would be importing corn? But also when you look at market signals, in that you had a situation last year where Brazil had to import soybeans. And so that's a complicating factor. It's a complex world, as you said, but when we look at trade is shifting significantly and dramatically around the world, and then, while it's not a policy directly related to trade, investment in infrastructure is going to be very important around the world.
Well, I think that's a great segue then to talk about trade infrastructure in Africa, and we had the chance to talk a little bit about this last night. Talk a little bit about what enhances and what impedes trade in Africa, and how we can really get more trade to take place within and between African countries.
Okay, thank you very much. First, let me say thank you to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for inviting us and putting up this session. I think it's a very great discussion. It's very informative, and I think it probably will add value to some of the initiatives that are going on around the world. But then let me contextualize the perspective from where I come from, in that I come from the Agriculture Research Council of South Africa, which is probably the largest single agriculture research institution on the continent, with the appropriate infrastructure to provide the kinds of solutions that the agriculture sector actually needs and has been doing so for the last 100 years. Now, be that as it may, the advantage of that has been that you then have a large commercial agriculture sector that's fairly dependent on new cultivars that it then uses to compete and gain market access out in the world, as well as the livestock sector that actually ends up with high quality products, largely because it's been supported through diagnostic and analytical laboratories that are able to provide the quality assurance in terms of the foods prior to export. So that in itself begins to create, at least for South Africa, the right environment around which the country can gain market access in a variety of situations. Take that into consideration for the fact that it's a country where largely the commercial farmers are not subsidized. And therefore, they've had since 1994 gone through major changes among themselves, where there's been consolidation, but the major driver for them has been competitiveness and productivity increases, largely dependent around their ability to use technologies coming out of the science and technology institutions such as ours. But then there's the other side of it, which is the development side of the agriculture sector, which is the rural areas among the resource poor, who very often have had very little access to technologies and the science. And the challenge has been, how do we get them into the market? In that if 40% of the communal and resource poor farmers in a country are the ones who have custody of the livestock of the country, that's more than 6 million cattle just to begin with. And many of those animals are not being used in trade, but are rather used for traditional purposes, and yet the same individuals are poor. How do you turn those assets into actual income for them, such that you alleviate poverty and improve food and nutrition security for them? And also you start to get them into the mainstream of the economy. What was interesting is that as South Africa has been working on these particular initiatives for quite a number of years, In came the issues that you raised, Dr. Bar-Yam, on the turning of corn into ethanol fuel, which started to raise the price of maize around the world. Now, South African maize is one of the most freely traded maize around the world. Immediately, you started to have producers that started to find themselves in a situation where their enterprises became competitive because the price at which they were fetching in the market of the maize was starting to become affordable for them to remain in business. Now, that had quite a big impact in the region because as much as they're getting higher prices, they're able to then sell that maize elsewhere outside of the region. And much of that went to China, it came to the US, and so on. What that did, then it created pressure in the neighboring countries where the food prices started to rise as well. Hence, you started to have this kind of impact of food price uprisings, which were not major, but rather did happen in places such as Mozambique and so on. Now, why didn't the food price issues happen in South Africa? The reason they didn't happen is because in the first place you have a system that is used to monitoring the inflows and outflows of maize for domestic use in the first place as part and parcel of national food security. So the grain storage systems that are functional, that actually enable the country to be able to feed itself. So as a country, you're a food secure country, but in terms of households, you probably have differences, pretty much similar to what you might find in places such as Brazil, and some of that similar to what you might find in parts of the US. Now, what does that mean then for the rest of the continent? What we found is that in much of the continent, what's lacking is the appropriate regulatory systems as well as the appropriate infrastructure such as you have in South Africa, which is the laboratories and the technologies to be able to provide for market access, and a regulatory system that's supposed to enable the goods to flow much more freely, almost absent or not in a manner that actually enhances trade. So that's the challenge that actually is happening. It is probably because of these kinds of reasons that you then had the Comprehensive African Agriculture Development Program, whose aim has been looking at trying to put together the right infrastructure, trying to put together the right regulatory and policy systems for market access, as well as trying to stimulate investments into agricultural research and development in order to enhance productivity within the continent.
I think this is such a very important issue because you've touched on a couple of things. One is tying into the whole importance of infrastructure, but from the standpoint of regulatory systems, which in fact the sanitary and phytosanitary issues, the food safety, the ability to actually export. Many countries have, developing countries have developed an agriculture product for export and then found that they don't have the regulatory system to actually participate in trade. So that's one area. But we also have, out of the Uruguay round, of course, the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement. And yet, we still find that a lot of agriculture trade is impeded by sanitary and phytosanitary issues, food safety. Maybe the panel could comment a bit on the whole issue of sanitary and phytosanitary, how it impacts trade. I mean, obviously, we've talked about the importance of the infrastructure.
Sure. I mean, the SPS agreement itself has been an effective tool in setting an international standard. But I think one of the things that the U.S. is trying to do in these ongoing negotiations is really to build on and elaborate and be more specific about the various provisions and core obligations in the SPS agreement. So what are sound risk management practices? What does it mean to base a standard on scientific evidence and a risk assessment? What are the proper response mechanisms at the border if there's a non-conforming shipment? How do we handle disputes in a way that is expeditious? Obviously, one of the as effective as the WTO dispute settlement system has been, it takes a long time to run its course. And so I think that now we're looking at, again, ways to make those core obligations that were put in place almost 20 years ago more practical, and to have more collaboration between governments as to what they mean in regulatory practice. The one other thing that I would say on kind of regulatory and legal competence, both to engage in international trade and to engage in international trade negotiations, I think this is really kind of a next generation issue for trade negotiations. And I think the first test case will be U.S. negotiations with Europe, where the emphasis really is on regulatory coordination, because conventional trade barriers, maybe with the exception of agriculture, but in most areas, they're already relatively low. So the real benefit that will come from this agreement for both sides, as well as the global trading system, is to figure out ways that our regulators can work more closely together. How can we figure out ways where, you know, if you're submitting a data set for marketing approval of a biotech product or a pharmaceutical product, you name it, are there parameters that we can establish to harmonize so that each country doesn't have to go through that same process, and you can have kind of, you know, each of us benefiting from the learning that has come before?
Any other comments on this?
Yeah, I think from where we come from, part of the challenge is that unlike in a place where you have large commercial enterprises that are able to put together their own systems and standards to be able to meet the export standards and requirements of another country, when you're dealing with 80 to 400 million small-scale farmers that in the first place are resource poor, it makes it very difficult by its own very nature in terms of just their own logistics as individuals to be able to get their products to market. And that's probably the biggest challenge within the continent of Africa. And that therefore actually which is why I was saying, that's what distinguishes sometimes South Africa from some of the countries, in that you have a government and an infrastructure in a country that's able to provide the services for those that need to be able to export. Whereas in many of these other countries, they're unable to have the kind of laboratories that are able to certify the quality of the products before exports. If you don't have that, how do you then enable a lot of the small-scale farmers to be still able to export their products and gain the kind of market access that is required, while at the same time still trying to deal with issues of sanitary and phytosanitary matters?
So I have just a brief remark, a little bit broader. I think within the context of this discussion, we're encountering issues where, you know, we have in mind a goal state, right? There's a situation that we would like to have, and we are developing policies to create that state, but not necessarily all of the conditions that are necessary to have are present. So thinking more generally about what are the set of things that one needs that self-consistently give rise to the goal state is something that we need to do more carefully. And having that in mind, you know, also which things need to come before which other things in order to achieve the effective approach to where we want to go is very important.
And how do you, and is your analysis, does it actually help identify how you could break down the system, the transport, the sanitary requirements, to actually help countries or help exporters or help people get their products into the market? How do you actually make that happen?
The answer is yes, but it's not magic as much as it is recognizing what are the important questions that have to be asked. Once you ask the right question, then you can frame the problem appropriately, identify the kinds of information that you need. There is a piece that is crucial, is recognizing that things work together and not separately. And that's core to thinking in a complex systems sense. And once you realize that, then it guides your understanding of how to understand both what's happening now, what you want to be present, and ultimately how to transition from one to the other.
Okay, so do we have an example of that someone on the panel can talk
I
about
can actually point
complex
to one.
systems?
I think
Go ahead.
Maybe one is the example that I sort of discussed with you last night.
That was great.
Where, for example, you sometimes don't necessarily need very complex solutions to a particular problem. If you take, for example, the tomato producers in Mali, in Bamako, that actually are trying to sell their tomatoes to those that are trying to buy them in Accra or trying to export them out of Ghana. Now, the problem is that the distance to travel for those particular tomatoes is about 1,000 kilometers, but the road network is a mess. Now, I was actually quite encouraged by a study that was done by Wageningen University and one of the Malian students to try and find out exactly how best to solve this particular problem or look for solutions towards it. One, they looked at the temperature changes in terms of the tomatoes as they're being shipped by truck all the way from Bamako to Accra. The other one was to look at the time of day at which they're getting transported. And the third one was to look at the road network conditions. Now, most of these tomatoes were being messed up because the conditions on the road were a mess. The road infrastructure was horrible, potholes were all over and so on. Secondly, you're transporting these things during daytime, in which case that they all rot and gets exposed to heat quite a bit. And thirdly, you're not managing the logistics in terms of the time around which the trucks and the route network. What they found was that if they changed the route network slightly and changed the time of day around which the tomatoes were being transported, transport them at night rather than during the day, immediately start to have a differences in terms of the manner in which these tomatoes are going to be treated in terms of temperatures, but also you're choosing a much safer route when there's less traffic on the road, and you get less of them actually rotting by the time they get to market. That's not necessarily just a matter of regulation. That's simply just basic information that people need to get on time to be able to use it to make their smart decisions.
Well, and you also mentioned, I think, last evening, the fact that they're looking at moving from trucks to rail cars because you have less damage, and you can actually control the rail cars. So, does Rabobank actually fund such kind of analysis of market impediments? Does it look at what kind of things do you fund in the developing world to make it easier for people in Africa and South Asia to actually access the global market?
We're doing some work in Africa now, but it's at a very early stage. Rabobank has investments in 4 banks, through Rabobank's development bank, in 4 banks in East Africa. And we have one of the analysts in our research group that works on those sorts of things, but it's one analyst right now. Much of what we do at Rabobank is finding connections or disconnections between our analysts or the markets in Brazil and what our analysts are seeing in China versus Europe. But not much is going on in Africa at this point, though it's booming quite quickly. I was over to see our friend, mutual friend J.B. Penn, between lunch and this meeting, and I asked him about East Africa and when that's going to be a factor, and he said now. Their sales, John Deere sales in East Africa are growing 30% per year. So the short answer is we're not funding a lot of ground level work in Africa per se now. That said, we've done a lot of work on Indonesia and Vietnam.
And did you want to add to that? Because you,
I had earlier comment, just while the details are not for discussion now, when China engaged in development, they didn't try to make the transition all at once. They created local areas with particular steps that they could accommodate at that time. And by doing it in a staged way, they were able to manage the development process in effective fashion. And this is something that should be understood as a broader strategy.
when we talk about increasing regional trade agreements, one of the things we found as we look at trade in developing countries is that while there's been a lot of focus of the developing world in getting more concessions that will be helpful to the developing world in the WTO negotiations, a lot of discussion in the launch of the Doha round, calling it the Doha Development Agenda, there seems to be many impediments to actually conducting trade within and between countries in Africa. And there's a lot of studies that show if you actually had more trade within regions, you could raise the incomes of farmers and create better agriculture opportunity for so many people and access to food. Talk a little bit about what are some of the impediments to actually getting regional trade within and between some of the countries particularly in the African continent?
Well, some of it is historical, in that if you look at the rail network, it was structured during colonial times to export goods out of the country, rather than to enable intra-trade within Africa. That has a major impact on how the various countries interact with each other, especially if you're shifting between those that used to be Anglophone versus Francophone, because also the systems are very different. Sometimes even the banking systems are very different, and that actually start to change the manner in which you could actually interact. But what I find interesting is that among communities that actually are not too far from each other, regardless of the border, there's enormous trade that's going on. If you look at the communities in East Africa between the various borders of Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, and so on, the amount of trade that's actually happening there, including Kenya, is quite significant. There's a lot of exchange of goods and a lot of exchange of money. Much of it is basic agricultural foods and a few commodities here and there. And much of that is not even regulated. So the question is, how best do we capture it in a manner in which that we start to find a way in which it adds value to the economy, it adds value to the livelihoods of the people.
So, but what about the tariff issues? I mean, there's often very high tariffs that developing countries are reluctant to lower. I mean, how do we address the tariff issues?
I mean, just a quick point on that. It's been a few years since I've seen the precise statistic, but there is more of that trade between developing countries than is generally appreciated, or would be reflected by the focus that developing countries placed on receiving concessions, mostly from developed countries. I mean, the fact is, at the time, it was well more than 50% of the tariffs paid by developing countries were paid to other developing countries. And so you can see that the opportunity here is really for everyone, for all sides, to reduce those barriers. And while there needs to be accommodation in trade agreements for differences in developmental levels, on a market access issue, to the extent we differentiate, the countries getting most hurt are generally those other developing countries who are losing export opportunities.
But isn't it also the fact that many of these countries don't have effective ways to get income, and the tariffs are really one of the only ways they have to build revenue for their own governments?
Well, that's true to some extent. One of the other things that you find is that there's a significant difference between those countries that are able to trade with products that have gone through additional value add. So agro-processing becomes a critical lever around which to gain market access. You can find on shelves of many of the countries within the continent products that actually can be produced in some of those countries that come from South Africa. Simply because they've gone through a proper agro-processing, and so on, and are able to gain market access much more easily. So it's sometimes not necessarily just a tariff issue, it's the whole manner in which the whole system is set up and the manner in which it interacts with each other.
Okay, getting back, what are some of the drivers other than high commodity drivers or prices that you have seen that are causing some of the instability from some of the studies, just sort of on the macro picture that you've done?
Sure. Again, I mean, these are things that we generally recognize. Unemployment, lack of economic opportunity are clearly key to social unrest. I think that in this context, I would focus on another, if you will, a cause. I think there's really missing a sufficiently global view of the problems that we face. In this context, in the context of the food issue, in this audience, the issue is being discussed in a global way. But many other policy discussions don't recognize how tightly we are linked globally, and don't recognize that just as in the United States, people are concerned about unemployment in different parts of the country for many years, we now have to think about that as a global issue. And the question of how do we address that as a global concern is still not yet really on the table. And that's manifest in the policies of many of the international organizations that we rely on to engage in economic policy making at the global level. Without understanding that the problems that we're facing, we've talked about it as a security context, but all of the economic and social issues that we're facing today are global concerns. And until we really think about them in that sense, we've talked about trade here in the local context, but the global context of trade is also linked very directly with unemployment and social conditions. And we really need to address them all together in order to have an effective policy that will alleviate the problems that we're talking
And
about.
what's the best forum to do that in?
I could try to take a stab at it. Maybe other people would like to say something first.
I don't think there is a single solution to, as he had indicated earlier, that we're talking about complex systems. And he's quite right to say the global trade systems have actually made us much closer to each other than we think and that we actually are aware. The level at which we're exchanging information is having major impact in the trading systems, not just globally, but even locally. We started a small project in South Africa where we started working with resource-poor farmers in a fairly dry area, about 2,000 kilometers from where they needed to sell their product, fairly remote. And we gave them cell phones. And all they needed to do was to get into a little local taxi, travel about 30 kilometers away, which is where the downtown is, get a sense as to what the market price for the goats was, and then from there they would send a message to the other ones to load the goats on the truck. If the market price is very low, they don't load the goats. Now suddenly, they went from having like 50 goats to more than 2,000 goats, and they were loading goats every week that were going to a market that's about 2,000 kilometers away. Wow. Now, all of that is about exchange of information and setting up basic information systems around which people can understand how market forces behave and how these things can happen.
Well, and basic technology with cell phones and so forth has really helped to enhance that in ways that we wouldn't have imagined even 10 years ago.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, speaking, so
Do you want to come back to me?
nobody's really answered the question of what's the best forum,
So,
which would lead me to believe that maybe we don't have one.
right. I think that's somewhat the case, but I actually, I think that right now it's fairly clear that decisions are mostly being made locally despite the global context in which we live. And I think in order to change that, the main thing is to show the effectiveness of global decision making. And rather than trying to create instruments of decision making, I think that the most important thing is to show that the information that we have, like the example that you gave, the decision-making capabilities that we can gain using the information and using science, which is the topic of our symposium today, that the fact that we can come up with much better decisions and policies that will actually improve things ultimately will drive the fact that people will listen to those decisions. So it's really about not necessarily creating sort of all at once, as far as I'm concerned, a global decision-making organization, but perhaps just for those who want to take the initiative to create effective discussions, among them the ones that are being held here. And if we can really show that the information that is being provided is effective, I think over time people will learn to listen. And that's really the power of the availability of information and communication today.
I think to answer your question, what we're trying to say is that probably the better mechanism to get this sorted out is to accelerate the rate at which we exchange information, and to ensure that the information that is being shared is accurate and it is timely for people to be able to make the decisions at the right time, to be able to engage in those kinds of activities. Because there's no use getting the information about yesterday's or last week's market prices when in fact you need to be able to sell your product now.
Right. So data analysis.
Data analysis critical, and our ability to exchange such data at all levels, including among the resource poor. Very often there's an assumption that when people are in rural areas and very poor, that they need the basic kind of 30-year-old technologies. It never works. It doesn't work. The biggest thing that has spurred trade amongst the the rural poor in most parts of Africa has been the cell phone. The cell phone.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I was going to, if I may ask my colleague a question, doesn't it get back to what's in the best interest of the world is not necessarily in the best interest of a local politician, a state politician, or a national politician, and
That's
we
true,
see that in
but-
Congress every day.
Exactly.
but so isn't that the answer to your that question is the answer to your question? How do you resolve to get people to act or think in a more in a way that recognizes all the implications, right? And I think social media, right, is part of that.
So, talking about global forums, we used to look at the solutions to agriculture trade, reducing trade distorting subsidies. We look to the WTO to solve all these problems. And I think we really can't have a discussion of trade without a discussion of the WTO. Now, we had a successful Uruguay round. It did a lot in the area of agriculture, including creating all the boxes and the phytosanitary. The Doha round started in 2001, and yet it's languished. So we've had a series of bilateral agreements, regional agreements around the world, not just with the US, but among and between many countries. I mean, what happens? I mean, there are certain issues that we cannot address without a global trade round. Things like subsidies, probably. What happens with the global trade round? I kind of throw that out to all of you who have different perspectives on trade.
Well, I think the trading system is going to be better off because of the proliferation of these bilateral and regional FTAs, only if they ultimately lead us back to Geneva and a multilateral round, because they are far from the ideal. It is in the most critical light, a balkanization of trade, where companies and agricultural producers have to meet rather tight rules of origin in order for their goods to qualify for preferential tariff treatment. It's not the ideal. On the other hand, for the countries that are less active in trade and see the proliferation of these agreements and see their trade interests being impaired, it is that much more incentive. Again, both for the ones that are active, because it's not the ideal solution, and for those who are hanging back, that will, what we have to hope create the incentive to get back into a multilateral discussion, and from a U.S. perspective, to access those markets where clearly we're not going to be able to negotiate on a bilateral or plurilateral basis. So I think an important first step in terms of the WTO showing its ongoing viability is whether they can pull together a small package in advance of the WTO ministerial at the end of the year in Indonesia. They have on tap an important series of agreements. It's not the broad-based agreement on industrial goods and agriculture, et cetera, but it's important work on trade facilitation and other matters, and it will at least show that we can take this baby step that hopefully, combined with these other incentives, that hopefully will bring us back to the multilateral table.
Anybody else want to talk about the multilateral agreement?
My sense is that the multilateral agreements, first of all, that are especially the regional trading blocs and the free trade agreements, are actually enhancing the manner in which people engage with each other. They're enhancing the manner in which people are understanding and having common interests. And the more you have a proliferation of this, the more you're likely to have much bigger trading blocs that actually have much more common interests than actually disinterests, and by their nature are probably one of the avenues around which you could remove some of the stumbling blocks that originally would have come up if those trading blocks would not have happened in the first place. That's a likelihood that we may see down the line, but the verdict is still out there.
Okay, so there's some hope. Many are saying that the Doha round is dead, but it's still alive and it needs to have a little life put into it.
Yes, after some recuperation period.
Okay. So let's get this. We have a question from Twitter, and I think it's a question I'll ask of all of you as sort of a final question, because I think it gets sort of to the heart of what we're talking about today. And that is, in your opinion, what can we do, what can the world do? I want to say we sitting in Washington, but what can the world do? What can be done to make sure that smallholder farmers succeed in the global market? That's the question from Twitter. Let me add on to that. And assuming that they succeed in the global market, I assume also that means that we will be adding and enhancing food and nutrition security around the world. So what can be done to really get the smallholder farmers to be a part of all of this? Who wants to start?
Go ahead.
Nobody wants to start with the Twitter question.
Well, this is an area in which we are putting quite a significant investment in ourselves in the first instance. And for that, I would start by saying we have to say thanks to the partnerships that we've got with DuPont through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and with Monsanto through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, around looking at coming up with technologies that are really suitable for smallholder farmers to be able to get the increases in yields that are required for them to get their products out there. So what's critical is that we need to find a way in which we create an investment climate into research institutions, not just for 1 year in terms of a project, but for multi-years, to create a consistency, to be able to deliver the kind of innovations and information much more consistently over many years, and the sustainability in the system. That's the one side of it. The other one is there needs to be really a relook at whether we need to be investing into agro-processing or post-harvest systems in order to manage the food systems and the flows of agricultural products. More than 20% of agricultural produce gets wasted or lost because of poor post-harvest handling. And we need to find ways of investing into systems that actually manage that. The third one I would probably dare to say is that it's not necessarily agriculture, but it has a major impact on agriculture and on market access and so on. And that is to find mechanisms to shift investments that actually incentivize the movement of agriculture goods and other goods from road to rail. Because that starts to create a much more stable mechanism around which you're getting your products out to market with less danger, with much more predictability. And the last one I would say, we are not going to be able to do this if you don't have a society that actually is capacitated and trained to be able to understand the science and technology and to be able to anticipate the things that need to happen out there.
Can I just follow up real quick, and then I'll let you answer? When you say we need to move from road to rail, what's happening with the building of rail infrastructure in Africa to facilitate that movement from road to rail?
Well, it's very difficult for me to speak for most countries in Africa because I don't have the real data. But I am aware that policymakers within the African Union have made a decision to make major investment decisions in terms of rail infrastructure. Within South Africa, there has been a major decision made by the government of South Africa to start to put more investments into rail, particularly with a particular focus on agri-logistics, which then means that we need to start to build the kind of grain silos for storage of goods, particularly amongst areas where the resource-poor farmers are, in order to be able to make sure that you don't experience those post-harvest losses. But it also means you need to have the kind of refrigeration systems that must handle the goods, so that by the time the goods get to market, have the right quality and are able to get to the market in good condition.
So I want to teach one additional concept of complex systems, and that is time scale. I mean, everyone knows what it really means. It's how long should we expect something to take? And one thing that it's important to realize is that changing smallholder farming takes a different amount of time than growing a big agribusiness. It doesn't work the same way. As you've mentioned, there are social, educational, infrastructural, policy, other things that are needed, and the changes are going to take a certain amount of time. So one of the things that we have to do is understand from an expectations point of view how long it will take and gear our plans for that time frame. And I don't think that we can expect the change in smallholder farming to take a few years. One should expect that it will take longer than that. And if it's going to take longer than that, then we have to think about what issues or challenges we have to address on a shorter time frame that are needed in order to create the context in which that will take place. And one of the things that has been studied and analyzed to be very important in this context is stability of global food prices. Stability of prices is inherently important to create a context in which decision-making by countries and individuals can function in the planning process that is going to take a period of 10 years or so. Right now, we have unstable food prices. And so in the context of this discussion, I go back to my earlier point that we really have to address the basic global food price issues, which have to do with bubbles created by speculation, which should be tamed, and also the tremendous pressure, which is on a much shorter time frame, which is due to the burning of food for fuel. We really need to, if we want to feed the world in the meantime, we really need to think carefully about how much food we can burn for fuel while we're trying to do that.
So let me just follow up on that for a second, and then I'll go back to the smallholder issue. What do you think ought to be done about addressing the feed for fuel issue, the food for fuel issue?
Right now,
because it's come up with three or four of the panelists now.
Right now, the prices of global food are basically at the threshold that we've identified for social unrest and political instability, which means that we're vulnerable to any kind of shock in terms of wide-scale unrest. It also means that there is, as we know, a huge amount of suffering globally. That price is currently not due to speculation, but is just due to the conversion of food for fuel. That's just because the speculative bubble has subsided, if you will, at the current time. I know that there are bills in Congress to reduce or remove the mandate on corn to ethanol conversion. It may even be necessary to have policies that roll that back in order to reduce the prices, surely over the short term, in order to alleviate global hunger. I just think that that's 100% makes sense. The original policies were created at a time when people didn't know what the impact would be. The measure of people's will to do the right thing comes up when people know what the situation is, and then they have the opportunity to decide.
Just a quick one, because we're discussing this issue of food for fuel within the context of food crops. But that's assuming there are no other technologies that actually can generate the same kind of fuel that we actually need to meet our energy needs without actually using food crops. Now, some developing countries have taken policy decisions not to specifically use food crops for their energy needs, simply because of the threat of food price uprisings and so on, but also in order to manage their food security requirements. Is it possible for a society to begin to rethink as to whether we could accelerate the release of the new technologies that actually would be independent of food crops in order to meet our energy needs?
Okay, I'm going to stop you for a second because our time has expired and we've got a very important speaker coming up, but I'm going to give our other two speakers a chance just to, if they'd like, answer the question on how can we help that smallholder farmer get into the global market.
Just very quickly, I have to resort to what I know, which is the trade and investment rules. I think there are things that disproportionately impact and rules that would disproportionately benefit the small landholders, trade distorting subsidies, export restraints, that kind of thing. The other thing that strikes me is we spend a lot of time thinking about how to help smaller enterprises succeed in international trade, smaller businesses, whether that's just through education, customs procedures, that sort of thing. It seems to me this would probably be an area, if there is a small landholder analog, to help them make the connections with the larger processors and enable them to become a part of these international supply chains.
What Rabobank likes to do is provide financing, to provide the inputs as well as to buy land.
Great. Well, thank you all. You've been a terrific panel. And I think all of you now see that the issue of trade as part of the overall agenda in enhancing food and nutrition security around the world is a very important one. And I think all of you have contributed greatly to the conversation. Thanks so much.